Greetings, this is Kretic. Today I'm excited to dive into the 2.6.4 Diablo 3 PTR patch notes. We'll be looking at them at a glance, and then we'll dive into some builds, some possible builds that I think might be heavily impacted or impacted enough that they'll make a difference to the gameplay going into Season 16. So just keep in mind that most of the builds that I'm going to mention or look over are probably going to be related to the wizard, since that's the class that I have most experience with. As far as the patch notes, we got a lot of quality of life changes related to armory tabs, Grandeur of keystones, primal legendaries, icons and such. We also have no longer have Paragon point swapping and greater rifts. And here is really big, especially keep this in mind when we're going over the builds we're going to look at in this video. The Season of Grandeur, Season 16, the buff for the Ring of Royal Grandeur will be given to us baseline, basically. And this buff will not stack with additional Ring of Royal Grandeurs, so I take that to mean that wearing a Ring of Royal Grandeur will no longer, have an additional effect. Like, there won't be a point to wearing or cubing a Ring of Royal Grandeur. Unlike previous seasons, this will not apply to non-seasonal players. This will definitely make it a little bit more difficult to test, so some of these builds I won't be able to put out like a full video on or anything like that if I want to until probably after the season starts, which is not typical, especially given the shorter time in the PTR. This is also of note, when completing a greater level 70 solo for the first time in season, Primal Legendary is guaranteed to drop. This means you're probably going to want, if you're starting out the season with a different class, then you're going to want to gear up and do greater rifts on. Just keep in mind that clearing that greater rift 70 solo will give you a free primal, so you probably want to complete that solo 70 on whatever class you're gonna need primals on. This changes things up as far as leveling earlier on in season quite a bit, I think, so just something to note. Alright, let's get into the said buffs that are going down in this PTR for Wizard. We have the Tal Rasha's set, we have DMO, and we have Vyrs that are all getting a 6-piece bonus increase. And Tal Rasha's, of course, if you're unfamiliar, you slot at least 4 different elements, you rotate them to keep up the 6-piece bonus. It's a fairly open set in that you don't have to ignite or put down a slow time, or you go into Archon form or anything like that to be able to gain your 6-piece bonus. The requirements as far as setup are concerned when engaging enemies are a little bit lower, so that's the fun thing about one of the fun things about Tal Rasha's is you dive right into dealing damage. DMO, of course, putting down those slow times, really cool set with managing the speed and controlling enemies. We have the Vyrs set, which is an Archon based set as well, so also very interesting set. So these two, DMO and Vyrs, appear to be getting about a 2 times increase, and then we have the Tal Rasha's here, which got quadrupled, so times 4. So this is going to be something that we're going to want to keep an eye on, especially see how much of a buff Tal Rasha's is actually going to get in the end. The other sets I'm actually more interested because my expectation is that this is going to be too much of a buff given the current builds available, and they're going to tone this down more than possibly the other sets. So I am actually more excited for DMO and Vyrs, but that's because I just like those builds. But anyway, Tal builds should still be very fun and accessible, and it'll make, in the very least, an increase to Tal Rasha will be great for speed farming for the wizard, because right now we're not in a great place as compared to, say, Condemned Crusader, at least for solo, right? So, alright, before we dive into builds, recall that the seasonal theme Grandeur gives us the Royal Ring of Grandeur effect baseline. So we're going to be looking for builds that can benefit from this effect more than other builds. And this will also be factoring in the set bonus increases, but I think builds that are going to be able to benefit from the seasonal theme in addition to whatever increases are given forth are going to pull ahead next season. So we're going to be looking into those. And some other builds that may not be benefiting quite as much, just to show the difference between the two, right? So I'm excited. Before we go, this is D3 Planner. If you haven't used this tool, I highly recommend it. Developed by Riv, and if you want to support him, just go to d3planner.com and click the link to donate. Note that at the time of this recording, the tool hasn't been updated for the new seasonal theme. That's because it just the PTR notes just came out, but in the future you'll be able to see hopefully 6-piece sets being completed when you tick some sort of setting for seasonal or something similar to that. But just keep that in mind, and I will make this D3 Planner available in the description below. Also, something to note with this particular D3 Planner is I put it together very quickly, so while all the primary affixes on items are fairly well placed for all the builds, the secondary affixes may or may not be set as they should. You know, for example, you may or may not need gold pickup, you may or may not need resist for certain builds. Torment build might need less resist than a Greater Rifting build, for example. Certain builds may need reduced control and pairing effects, others get immunity, so you just kind of have to look at them. I will not be covering some builds that are probably going to be very strong with the PTR changes, such as Vyr Frozen Orb, Vyr Star Pact, DMO channeled Frozen Orb configurations. These sort of builds, I just don't have as much experience with them, and I don't feel comfortable putting out builds based on these configurations as yet. Now, I'm very excited for this build. This is the Arcane Torrent Static Discharge Monalteal Deathwish Vyr-based build. This is a reverse Archon build, meaning you deal your damage outside of Archon, not inside Archon. You're just using Archon to build stack count and buff your character so you can deal massive damage outside of Archon. And I've got a full guide on this, so I'll link that as well. It goes into detail about all the skills and rotation and affixes you're going to want to look out for. General idea here is that we do have the Crown's buff bracer, so we are immune to knockback and stun effects, and we're using the high attack speed from the pig sticker to get higher stack counts and allow us to proc our Monalteal at those highest breakpoints, right? So, yeah, this is supposed to be Audacity, my bad. Anyway, yeah, the cool thing here with the Ring of Royal Grandeur theme, the Grandeur theme, is that before I was having an issue with resource, so I was using, instead of the black hole, I was using the Magic Ribbon Conduit to make up for the resource. And this worked very well, especially against single target Rift Guardians, lower density, all those sort of situations. However, with the Ring of Royal Grandeur in play, we can now go full-on meta and use the Black Hole Spellsteal, run with the Swami and the helmet. The Wizard Hat can roll with an affix of Arcane Power on crit. In addition to what you already have on your source, this just should take care of the resource issue, while still allowing us to run the Black Hole Spellsteal. So you're getting that extra damage from the Spellsteal. It's additive damage, but when you hit a lot of enemies, it's going to be a lot of additive damage that's coming in. Should be a few Greater Rifts level increase from this spell alone. And then also, this frees up the cube for us to place whatever we want, right? I went for the Strong Arm Bracers, going to be a huge increase when you're hitting enemies with the Black Hole, and this will be a large part of your play and rotation anyway, so huge increase to damage. The 30% should give you about 2 Greater Rifts increase, so we're looking at a few Greater Rifts here, a few Greater Rifts here. plus the 5 that you or 4.5 that you're probably going to have from the increase to Vyr. Anyway, I'm expecting somewhere at least 8 Greater Rift level increase to this build alone, so which is huge. It's just humongous, and it's going to be an amazing build to play for next season, I think. So here we have a Tal Vyr set mix, 6-piece Tal combined with the 4-piece Vyr bonus. 4-piece Vyr, of course, giving us those huge amounts of attack speed, while we're going to be leveraging the 6-set bonus, the extra damage from the Tal set. I've set this up similarly to the previous build, in where we're doing a Reverse Archon build here with Arcane Torrent, Static Discharge as well, proccing the Paralysis and Manalt Heal. It's a little bit more difficult with the Tal set, but just because you have to put in so many elements, and the build itself is already skill-wise is a little jam-packed full, but I think I found a configuration that I'd like to at least test out, see how it does, you know, if the Tal set increase has any bearing on if this sort of build can do very well. Difficulty here, of course, we have to drop the pig sticker, so we're losing that beast and human damage. However, and we're also losing out on the 1.5 base attacks per second. Here we only have 1.4 with the Deathwish, so another detriment to the build. You have to put more attack speed on your gear to get to the same level as where the Vyr build would be at, right? So, however, another change here is because we have to use the Tal amulet, we have to use Convention of Elements instead of the Endless Walk set, right? Vyr build, we were using the Endless Walk set. I think the Endless Walk set is more forgiving in that the randomness of your paralysis procs, it doesn't matter quite when they happen as long as you're standing relatively still, whereas this build you kind of have to line up your cooldown with the Convention of Elements, so that once you come out of Archon, you have that window of lightning positioned when you deem it, you feel that it would be most necessary, right? And that's the difficulty. You need fairly specific cooldown requirement. Something like 62.23 or so should be the bare minimum, I think, if I recall correctly. But it's a similar build. We're using lightning for the static discharge, fire, chain reaction. We still have the extra defense from both Halo of Carini and the Orb of Infinite Depth, so we haven't compromised there at all. We're using Black Hole Spellsteal for the cast for Arcane, and then we have on our bracers the Cold affix. So when we're in Archon, Cold element will be up and running and will proc the Cold Tal bonus. So another thing I opted for is the Slow Time rune. I just felt that this might be able to delay enemies when you're Archon, let you survive a little bit easier, but it's fairly open, I think. If you somehow feel there's a better rune out there, you can certainly choose that. But yeah, fairly cool setup, similar build. Can't fit in the strong arms, has COE as opposed to the Endless Walk, and can't fit in the pig sticker. So I'm expecting it to be a little bit less damage just based on those facts alone. However, you never know. If the Tal does get buffed, or damage gets increased on the 6-piece considerably, then this may be worthwhile, something to look into. And the Arcane Power and Crit here also coming into play to help us out, similar to the other build as well. Continuing on our Vyr focus, or this one was sort of Tal and Vyr focus, but continuing on our Vyr sort of Archon focus, we're going to look at a generic build here for pushing with Vyr. The idea here was just to stay in Archon as much as possible, higher stack counts, just go crazy with the Archon stacks and the Swalmy overlap and all of that, and deal as much damage as possible at range, right? So we got the Starfire and etc. And this is an example, I think, of a build that will benefit from the Ring Grandeur, but not as much as some of the other builds, right? So the best we can probably do here is fitting in a Leorc's Crown for faster resets, and we already have the Zodiac in this build, but the Leorc's Crown here will knock off about 5 seconds from the cooldown and let you reset Archon all that much faster. It goes down from about 15 seconds gap to 10 seconds gap, so it's pretty darn huge in my opinion still. So it would allow you to stack up quicker, but again, not as much of an impact as far as the seasonal theme is concerned. I just wanted to include it here because it is sort of a reference build to look at. If you're looking at if you've seen my Vyr MH Chantodo, this is a hybrid build. It's both ranged and close-up damage, so we're dealing damage close-up with Audacity and the Chantodo's waves that are coming out from your character dealing damage. We're stacking these up outside of Archon form, and then we're in Archon form, they release, right, and deal damage. The ranged mechanic, we're just going to be using in Archon, we're going to be using the beam, the Archon beam to help deal damage. So it's it's a cool build. You have to position properly though. And the cool thing here that we were able to do is fit in the strong arm bracers with the Ring Grandeur. Normally wouldn't be able to do that, but we were able to slot the Swami for extra resource, and again, put the strong arm bracers in. Since we already had spell steal in this build, that's going to be a fairly good large chunk increase to this build. But again, this build is several greater ifs lower than the aforementioned Reverse Archon build, so it's something to keep in mind, but it is a very fun build and something to toy around with if you're interested in that. Now we're going to be taking a look at some Vyr speed builds, Grandeur speed builds for solo speeds mostly. Here is one, the Menaltiel Zodiac Speed. We do not have the In-Geom in this setup. We instead use the pig sticker to help us, get those higher breakpoints faster, lessen the requirements on hitting, beam stack rate, breakpoint, etc. You can read more about that in the guide, but cool thing here is this will actually make more of an impact than the push build, I think. Putting in the Leorc's Crown for this particular build is going to be huge because we already have such a high cooldown amount with this particular speed build that putting in the extra cooldown from the Leorc's Crown gives us like almost 75%, and that's going to give us insanely quick resets, especially with the Obsidian Ring. It's going to be very fluid, it's going to be able to push very high for at least a solo speed, so it's going to be pretty strong in my opinion, even though, Leorc seems like not as an interesting of an addition to the build. I think it's a very powerful one indeed for a speed build. And now moving on, we're looking at the In-Geom variant, which uses the slower attack speed Starfire. This is going to be a 1.4 base attacks per second weapon, as opposed to 1.5 with the pig sticker. Note that the amounts displayed on D3 Planner include the attack speed on the weapon multiplied in, right? So that's why it's displayed a little bit differently, but nonetheless, you're going to be doing something similar here, using the Leorc's Crown. The effect here won't be as drastic. I think this particular build will not benefit from the Leorc's Crown as much as the other build, simply because we already have the In-Geom, and resetting Archon is a lot easier with this setup. This is a lower greater rifting build as compared to this build, for example, so just take it for what it is and use it for, farming those quicker rifts, getting lower gems up, right? So that's what I will probably be using this build for if I go Vyr next season for speed. Now that we're pretty much through the Archon section, the Vyr section, let's get into some more Tal Rasha builds, because I'm sure that's what a lot of you are looking forward to. I put together a rough setup based on what I know of the Firebird build for Star Pact, Firebird Star Pact, and what I think would work as good skills for a Tal Rasha variation. So this is Tal Rasha Star Pact, and basically what you're doing is you're using the Shaman Del Seer to help keep up your arcane power, replenish your arcane power, grouping mobs together in very thick packs of density, and then you're going to manually cast your Star Pact and then immediately channel your channeled ability. This will engage the Deathwish, multiplier and the Sigil multiplier, so that when the Star Pact lands and deals all that massive damage, and including this is a huge build for area damage, so we have a ton of area damage in this build, it's just going to decimate those packs of enemies. And that's the general idea of the current meta for Firebirds, at least. It's a similar idea, right? So, tried to put something together. This is very rough. I'm not the foremost expert on Star Pact. This was just something I could put together to sort of form in my head like how powerful this is going to be. And I'm looking at it, and it's going to be pretty darn powerful. So, yeah, so this is probably the reason Tal Rasha, if there was any reason Tal Rasha was going to be nerfed, it's going to be this build. In the PTR, and sorry, that's the wrong word to use. If Tal Rasha, if the damage is going to decrease within the PTR, changes, Tal Rasha, it's going to be because of Star Pact here. So, anyway, I kind of just set it up as comfortable as I could. We're using, similar to, while we could use Karini, I feel that Halo Varlis and the Ancient Parthens give the build more tankiness and allow it to group up enemies easier. That's why I went with the Halo Ancient Parthen combo, or stuck with it rather. Note here that we do still have the Convention of Elements, so it's a very glass cannon build, but able to deal tremendous amounts of damage. What is going to be really huge for this build in particular with the Season of Grandeur is usually you wouldn't be able to put in the Endless Walk set, but you can see here we have Endless Walk equipped. Endless Walk, if you recall, when you're standing still, can give you up to 100% damage multiplier, which is huge for increasing the Greater Rift scaling. So Tal Rasha's already at the default 6-piece increase is going to get about a 9 GR boost, and then on top of that, being able to place this Endless Walk set is going to boost it up at least 4 Greaterus more. So, as long as you can survive on like a really good fished, comfortable mob type, then you should be able to decimate in the Greater Ifs, right? So, anyway, this is going to be a very competitive build. Don't forget the Arcane Dynamo here, very important, stacking up those stacks with your signature before you unload, right? And the skills here, the elements can be swapped around a little. I just figured like Static Discharge was really good at keeping up arcane power, because of arcane power on crit. You also get, you got your arcane here, you get extra defense from the safe passage, which would be really nice. So we'll see if this ends up being close to the final build, but I'm expecting something similar to this to be really powerful for solo. Something to note with the Star Pact build is that it's more of an in-game setup build, because its dependence on both Paragon and Augmentation for its reliance on those for defense is quite heavily required, in my opinion. I usually don't recommend to players to start this build until at least 1200 Paragon. 14 would probably be a better mark to switch over to Star Pact build if you are planning on that, but it's definitely an in-game build. So if you're a more casual player, or you just don't like this build, how it plays, we're going to take a look now at some more traditional, standard Tal Meteor Shower channeling builds. And I'm really excited about these as well, because they're still going to have a lot of damage. This setup in particular is a Halo of Karini based build. It's very similar to what we've seen in the past. You might run Blur, you might run Unstable Anomaly here, that's an option, so keep that in mind. Another thing here is that I've gone for the Cinder Coat as a main means of increase, since we already have a lot of crit hit damage. The Witching Hour, I think, would not provide quite as much damage increase as the elemental damage from a Cinder Coat, or even a Mage Fist for that matter. But it's not as large of an increase as you would hope for a the Grandeur bonus, but it's still something, and this will still be a very viable build. I mean, we're already clearing 110 plus in current seasons with this build. Some players I've even seen go as high as 114 with this build, so this will just increase the power of the build a little bit more. It's a very tanky setup. You've got the Aquila, the Unity, double Unity with the follower token. You've got the Galvanizing Ward with the Ash Nagars. Another option here for the bracer slot is the Krelm's buff bracer. So if you're in hardcore especially, I would consider going Krelm's instead. So that's something to consider. And then you yeah, the other setup here, this one relies on the Halo of Carini for defense, so it's more, you still have to sort of move around a little to keep up the storm armor and all of that. This particular setup here, whoops, forgot to swap the skill. I'm going to balance more around the Halo of Arlise, and I think we can benefit, similar to what we did on the Star Pact build with the Grandeur bonus. We're going to slot, instead of the Unity, we're going to slot the Endless Walk set here as well on the Tal channeling build. So this will be a little bit harder to play, but I think a lot more rewarding in, as far as greater rifting is concerned. And it's still a very accessible build. Tal Meteor, one of the great things is Tal Meteor channel, at least early season, you don't really need any specific items. You can go for just Vite gloves, Vite weapon, you know, yeah, all that. You don't necessarily need the meteor damage on the source, you know, it's just very open as far as gearing is concerned. It's very easy to gear up, right? So anyway, that's just something you want to consider when you're choosing a first build, first push build in season, because this is a push build still. This particular setup, I've opted for Unwavering Will for the little bit of extra damage, but you could go Blur here for extra defense, but this is going to be huge. The Tal set bonus increase in combination with the Traveler's Pledge is just going to boost this build through the roof. A little bit less so than Star Pact, of course, but still amazingly increase. And the reason I went for the Halo of Arlise and the Ancient Parthens combination here, remember that this Ice Armor now will cast Frost Nova when we take damage, and the Ancient Parthens give us damage reduction to enemies that are stunned or frozen within 25 yards. So it's going to give us a lot of damage reduction when we're going through the rift, and I think this synergizes much better with the Endless Walk set than the Carini does. So anyway, that's just my opinion, and eager to try this one out, see if it works, if I need to tweak it. My expectation is that I will need to tweak the resource on this build, so I might need to put swap in a Topaz perhaps on the helm, or maybe put RCR instead of area damage on the shoulders, something to this effect, right? Something also to note with the Tal Russia Meteor Shower builds is I currently have Frost Nova Frozen Mist equipped. This is my preference, but you can run with dual channeling abilities. That means both the Arcane Torrent Static Discharge and the Ray of Frost spell. Something to keep in mind with that dual channeling setup is that you have specific attack speed breakpoints in regards to Etched Sigil, and we can see those Etched Sigil breakpoints here. And we have different breakpoints for Arcane Torrent, because it's coefficient of 3, as opposed to Ray of Frost, which is coefficient of 2. So depending on which channeling spell you're using the most, you're going to want to balance your attack speed around that. And usually it's just as simple as either allocating your just base for Arcane Torrent, Static Discharge. I usually take off all my attack speed from gear and just put attack speed into Paragon, should be fine at that level, 1.54 to 1.64 I think is the range. And then for I usually hit that breakpoint, and then for Ray of Frost, if you're running Ray of Frost, I usually just, you're going to have to deallocate, unallocate some Paragon when you're running the Ray of Frost variation to have it sigil, you know, casting those meteors as quick as possible, right? And it's not all of your Paragon, it's some of your Paragon. So you have to take a look at the specific breakpoint, and I will put that link in the description below. That will segue right into our speed build. Meteor Speed is going to be very big next season, I expect, especially with the Tal Rasha increase to the 6 speed. I'm really excited for this build. This is a Tal Rasha Meteor channeling speed build, carried over from last season with a few swaps. The Grandeur bonus, of course, is going to allow us to fit in a different item set. So we used to run with the Unity, double Unity, and the follower token to give us an extra 50% damage reduction, similar to the channeling push build. I'm suggesting here that we should slot the Inswalk. The difference here is that I think at a speed greater rifting level, it'll be a lot easier to survive, especially with the Karini bonus instead of the Halo Varlise bonus. It won't be as required. The Parthen's Halo Varlise won't be as required at this greater rift level, so you'll be able to get by just fine defensively, I think. It is a loss of quite a bit of defense, but you have to consider In the Swalk still has gives damage reduction when you're moving around, so you still have that. We've got a couple of swaps I made here to help boost up the defense of the build. Of course, we've got a lot of vitality in this build already. From it being, you know, a meteor-based build, you can fit those extra Vite rolls in. We have a lot of extra armor rolls, such as on the shoulder. I've swapped in the Amethyst in the helmet, and how I did this was basically I got rid of Scramble, going back to Power of the Storm. So you will move slower through the rift, but this will manage your resource instead. And then we swap back in Deflection from Conduit, you know, because we're going to use this for defense. It's going to give us that extra shielding and help keep us safe. So I'm hoping that these minor changes and tweaks help to sort of offset the loss of Unity, and just getting higher augmentations and higher Paragon I think will help out with this build as well, helping it feel more smooth and allowing it to clear higher speed levels. One of the cool side effects is you get to run in group more often, and it won't be such a bother to swap items because we're running with In the Swalk and not Unity, which would not work in group, right? So with that in mind, you can of course always go back to running the double Unity if you're solo, and then just put in something like a Cindercoat to boost your damage just a teeny bit and help manage your resource even better, right? In this setup, we're running the Conduit with the Scramble, so it will move faster through the rift just a tiny bit, but anyway, something to consider for certain. Notice that both of these builds I utilize a not often used gem. This is the Invigorating Gemstone, so it will prevent us becoming crowd controlled by any of the Frozen, Nightmare, you know, Knockback. Any of those effects are all pretty much all going to be nullified except for Wormhole. I think Wormhole still affects your character, so. But very useful setup. I feel it's a better gem to use than Bane of the Powerful. I mean, Bane of the Powerful, yes, you're going to be dealing more damage, but you're going to be getting knocked around more, and you're not going to be channeling your Deathwish as often, so you're not going to get hits as often. I feel they're about the same as far as power is concerned, and I just feel the Invigorating Gemstone gives a more fluid run as far as speed is concerned, and I enjoy the game more as from a speed perspective when I'm wearing this gem. Of course, if you're in group and your group buffs are giving you immunity to crowd controlling pairing effects, of course definitely you're going to want to swap that Bane of the Powerful in, giving that extra 20% damage and extra 15% damage versus elites and damage reduction versus elites, right? So Now this here is going to be a Tal Explosive Blast, Tal Russia Explosive Blast speed build for greater risk speeds. We'll come back to Explosive Blast later on, but we're going to just sort of go through the different Tal Russia configurations because I don't know what's going to end up being good, or better rather, if DMO is going to end up being better for speed or if Tal Russia is going to end up being better for speed at this point. So we're just going to look at everything, right? So here the setup's similar with the Grandeur effect. We're going for the Endless Walk instead of the Unity. Here we are going for the Aquila. So this is the new item. I used to use the Leoric's Crown in this set, but given that the Leoric's Crown was just a DPS boost, right? Just a minor DPS boost. Well, not minor, but it was a DPS boost, but not as significant as I think the Endless Walk is going to be. Putting in the extra defense via the Aquila bonus I think will be very useful. Now, the one thing about this build is I don't know if the resource is going to be balanced. It's likely you're going to have to, like I've already got resource on the shoulder, but you might even need to roll resource on the weapon, right? Something like this to be able to balance that resource a little bit better. We already have Power of the Storm and Ray of Frost Cold Blood, so it's very low cost, but that is my major concern here. To that end, I've slowed down the build a little. So you can see here that we're running now Prism instead of, I used to run the movement speed rune on Diamond Skin, Sleek Shell, which gives 30% movement speed. We have, you know, high cooldowns, or sorry, low cooldown, so this will be going off fairly often. But instead of the movement, we're now going to use Prism to help reduce the arcane power cost of the skills that we're casting. This will help manage the Aquila bonus more often. In addition, any build that I use Aquila on, I usually look at my Paragon, and it's up to you, but putting in max arcane power and making sure you've got, you know, max AP on your wand source, that sort of thing, are fairly beneficial because this increases the pool size and increases the 10% amount, the wiggle room for Aquila, right? So you have, it helps you maintain the bonus even more. So that's something to consider. It's an option, I would say. But I'm very excited that this is one of those builds that is going to gain a lot of power. Based on the fact that you're able to swap in Endless Walk where there used to be a defensive item, and now we're still able to maintain that same level of defense that we had in the past. Whereas versus we were just looking at the Meteor build, we weren't able to slot anything that sort of made up for the defense because we already had the Aquila there. This build, on the other hand, was missing the Aquila, so we're able to add that extra defense in, and it should feel a lot smoother and very powerful and more, hopefully more in line with some of the other speed builds, even though we're going to move through the Greater Rift at a slightly slower pace. Cool thing about this build, it's a channeling build, and we have the Edge Sigil, which casts our Arcane Spinders that are on our bar, so while we're channeling Ray of Frost, it will cast both our Chain Reaction. We'll also be have this on autocast or numlock, and then the Edge Sigil randomly selects a skill, so every now and again it will cast the black hole, but it will only select it once every time. So Edge Sigil has its own internal cooldown sort of thing, where, you know, if it's cast black hole within the, you know, past couple of seconds, it's going to wait until this spell's cooldown comes up before it becomes eligible again to cast. So yes, you are casting black hole quite a bit, and it is going to be very useful for grouping up elite packs, density, that sort of thing when you're going through the rift. So a very, very useful sort of setup for a speed, I think. And it does take away from your explosive blast casts a little bit, so DPS not as high as if you, say, just got rid of the black hole, but I still think it's better for a speedrun to have the black hole in this sort of setup. Pretty cool, pretty cool. And then as an alternate build, you could just stick with the Leoric's Crown, and then another item you could use instead of Endless Walk would be to slot the Strong Arm Bracers. So this would be more of a utility setup. You'd have higher damage through the Strong Arms. Pulling in the enemies would debuff them. This is getting cast a lot, so you're pretty much going to be debuffing most everything you engage, every elite pack you engage, with the 30%. Pretty nice boost. So if you don't like the Endless Walk playstyle or waiting on Endless Walk to stack up, this is another configuration you can go after. The cooldown on the Leoric's Crown should help with mobility as well, because higher cooldown will lower your higher CDR will lower your cooldown on teleport, allow you to cast that more often. You know, you can slot the Sleek Shell in this setup because you don't have the Aquila. Resource isn't as much of an issue. So I am interested to try this one out as well. I think it will also be fairly strong. You are running with the Unity again, double Unity, so it's more of a solo setup as opposed to, whereas this one can probably be used in group, right? So something to consider. But this will definitely produce a slower clear at a higher greater rift probably, whereas this will be a faster clear at a slightly lower greater rift, right? So they both have their function. Now let's move on to Tal Frozen Orb. So Frozen Orb is going to be a bit different than Explosive Blast. Explosive Blast is more cooldown based, whereas Frozen Orb is more attack speed, area damage, resource cost reduction sort of base, right? And here with the Grandeur, again, we're just looking in. One of the simplest things we can do with this build, with the Tal Frozen Orb setup, is just to add in a Witching Hour. You're going to see a large theme here with the the Frozen Orb builds of either adding a Witching Hour, a Frostburn. The damage bonuses will be somewhat hefty because Frozen Orb again can benefit from the attack speed that a Witching Hour can give, in addition to the crit hit damage. So, which is quite nice. Especially in this case, it should be, you know, a 1 to 2 greater rift, maybe a 2 greater rift increase just from being able to slot this item, which is quite nice. This is a focus and restraint setup. This build in particular is one of the quickest clearing speed builds that Wizard has. I'm not saying it's the highest pushing, but it's just one of the quickest clearing. You can clear in like 2.5, 3.5 minutes, 4 at most, I would say, and it's just super fast clears for the level of speed that you're doing. Again, not as quite as high as some other builds, but it's still very good. And you may be asking why I've gone for the Witching Hour as opposed to if you'll see here, I have an alternate setup just to display why I go for the Witching Hour. If you're going for the Strong Arms, number one, it's not a cooldown based build, so your Black Hole has like an extremely long cooldown, like an 11-second cooldown, right? So this is not going to be up all the time, and you're pretty much only going to be able to use it mostly on 1 out of every 2 elite packs that you engage most of the time, if it's a dense enough rift, right? So that alone is going to be huge, in my opinion. But you also consider here the damage, and granted the skill 6 set bonus isn't applied right now, just keep that in mind, but the damage here of Arcane Orb, 202 trillion, right? DPS, and then you swap here to the Witching Hour setup. Same gear except for the Witching Hour. And you'll notice 187. But the Witching Hour, as long as you have it highly rolled on crit hit damage, it's always going to be consistent. It's always going to be there. You know, at most you're looking at somewhere between a 3 and 7% difference in damage. But you're considering here this will be up all the time, whereas your Strong Arms is only up every so often. Now, the big debate here, I think, is Strong Arms, I think, can still apply to the Rift Guardian, so that may make a difference. But at most, I think it's a wash, considering you're going through the Greater Rift so many times not having the damage bonus from Strong Arms, and then you finally get to the Rift Guardian, and you get that extra bonus every now and again. It's a wash, right? It averages out. So that's why I go with the Witching Hour. gives you more attack speed, more damage. It's fairly consistent. I think it's the better option here. So anyway, this is a great build to consider, one of the quicker clearing builds in the Wizard's arsenal. Moving on, we're going to take a look. We're going to stay on Frozen Orb, but we're going to go into DMO. So DMO also got about a ×2 multiplier for the PTR as it's currently set, subject to change, of course. Some of the push builds we're going to take a look at. An example of a build that doesn't benefit very well from the Grandeur bonus is my beloved Orb of Infinite Depth with teleport build. So the idea here was to retain the added tankiness from the Orb of Infinite Depth in combination with the Halo of Carini, of course, when pushing, while still having a teleport to move around with the Illusionist to reset, just be able, and this is a kiting build, you're spawning more elites with the Nemesis Bracers, you're pulling them along with you, trying to whittle them down as you go, killing trash as you go, sort of situation. Note that this build has no pull, so it does not have a black hole, it does not have a twister, so that's one of the main downsides of the build. Other than that, it's been one of my favorite builds to push on playstyle-wise. The big downside here was we already had the Witching Hour equipped. There was no way to add in a Witching Hour. There's no way to benefit from Strong Arms because, again, we don't have a pull. So the biggest increase here is Frostburn, and at that it's added in with your other 40%, so 60%. So it's more like a 14% total increase to damage here as opposed to the 20% as displayed of cold damage. So not as lucrative as some of the other push builds, but I'm trying to show examples of builds that don't benefit from this as well. From the Grandeur changes, like the standard, what I would consider meta DMO Frozen Orb setup, and that's the setup that runs without teleport. So it retains the Orb of Infinite Depth and the Carini setup for extra defense, but we don't have teleport to help us move around, which makes it extremely frustrating in my personal opinion, but it does let you slot some more power, especially with having Black Hole Spell Steal. You're also able to slot the Strong Arms. Again, here we have an example of a build that we were already using the Witching Hour. So again here, this build from the Grandeur change is not going to be impacted as high as the third build I'm about to show you, but I just wanted to set this build up as well, just to show you, a different setup if you want to play Frozen Orb like how it was played in the past. This is something you can examine. The build I'm going to recommend going forward for DMO Frozen Orb Push is the Aetherwalker variation. I love the Aetherwalker build. Other community members have definitely won me over in this regard. It is a little bit more difficult to play, but having that extra, skill, knowing when to move around, so something to consider here is that these two, this build is more elite focused. This one is definitely more trash focused, but can kill elites if you have a good pylon, for example. Whereas this build here with the Aetherwalker is very heavily trash focused, trash centric, because we are using the Ranslor pull, the Energy Twister pull, right? So it puts them on top of one another, which is huge for this build because we're dealing so much area damage, right? So the Pixel pull, as it is also known, is hugely beneficial here with the Twister. So, but since you can't pull elites with this effect, less so. So, pylon spawns, engaging elites will be less lucrative for certain. You can probably still benefit from a conduit, but engaging elites will be not worth it most of the time with this particular setup. And here, there are a lot of skill options. I'm running currently with Barrier Blades. If you want more resource, you can run with Siphoning Blade to get. This would give you extra protection, this will give you extra resource. For example, if you want more defense, you can swap out elemental exposure for blur. Keep in mind that elemental exposure, it's highly beneficial to have a element that you don't have a lot of, so not cold, probably fire would probably be a good one to have, for example, because we don't really have a fire skill with which to debuff enemies, right? So something to consider there, giving us that extra additive damage, or debuff damage, rather. The thing here we're using with this build, and what makes it so positioned very well for an increase to damage, is in the past it wore the Shamadel Seer in the belt slot and it cubed the Crown of the Primus. Well, here we can wear the Crown of the Primus, benefit from the extra arcane power on crit, and it's up to you whether you want to swap out the arcane orb damage for int. That would probably be easier to set up in the least, but just going for what is essential here, the extra arcane power on crit here would give us the extra resource to spam Frozen Orb more often. It's a very engaging playstyle, teleporting around the map, finding density, pulling them together, making sure you're hitting them without moving around too much to maintain the Endless Walk bonus. So highly beneficial here because we're able to now slot the Witching Hour. This gives us an extra attack speed breakpoint, amazing crit hit damage now where we might have been lacking otherwise. So this will be probably at least a 2 Greater Rift increase for this build. Very huge, as opposed to the other builds which only got like a 1 Greater Rift level increase about, and not even, right? So this build will be one to look into going or trying out in the season to come. Now, if you thought the push build was pretty nifty, let's take a look at some DMO Frozen Orb Speed Greater Rifting builds that you might run with in Season 16. This one is a alteration of my previous configuration. Note that I am running now with the Unity as opposed to the COE. This is mostly because the extra defense I felt was warranted given the high damage that a lot of the monsters are dealing, and the sort of glassiness that the setup has. My preference is to use Unity and retain pool bonuses and maybe do, a few Greater Rifts lower, like 2 to 3 Greater Rifts lower than I would with COE. But if you're not using pool bonuses, COE is also an option with this build. Just keep in mind that you might have to use something like Blur in combination with COE and find some other means to make up resource other than Astral Presence, right? So just keep those sort of swaps in mind as you're looking at these builds. But I'm going to go over what I think would help out this build as far as the seasonal Grandeur bonus is concerned. Keep in mind that we already have the Witching Hour in this setup. Aforementioned, the Strong Arms is not going to be quite as strong as the Witching Hour for this setup, in my opinion. And the fact that we have 2 belts, the Shaman Seer we definitely need, the Witching Hour for damage, and then we have 2 bracers in contention, the Nemesis Bracer and the Strong Arm Bracer. It's going to be very difficult, especially solo. I guess if you're in a group setup and you're running COE, you might be able to drop the NIMS if someone else in the party is running NIMS, but that's a different setup entirely, right? In that configuration, you would be well off and run both the Witching Hour and the Strong Arms for extra damage, right? But this setup is focused on solo, so we have to have the Nemesis Bracer. And yeah, so there's just no room for the Strong Arms. Better bonus is Witching Hour, so for our bonus item, we put in the Frostburns. It's a little bit less than 1 Greater Rift impact, whereas the Strong Arms is closer to 2, right? So, or the Witching Hour, rather, is also closer to 2 Greater Rift increase. So, something to consider. And here, just to confirm, or to show you rather, here's the same exact setup, just with Strong Arms swapped in, and I've applied the Strong Arms. You can see here, 202 trillion DPS, and then you swap to this one with the nearly perfectly rolled Witching Hour, and you have a very close, very respectable 196 damage per second that's kept up all the time, right? So you don't have to bother with applying the debuff even. So Anyway, this speed build it's already clearing, like I got a video out there with me clearing, I can't remember what season it was, but I was clearing Greater Rift 94s at about 14 or 1500 Paragon fairly readily with this build, so expect this to also be, despite not being able to benefit from the Grandeur bonus quite as much as other builds, still to be a great contender for next season. So I'm very excited for this DMO Explosive Blast push build, circling back to Explosive Blast again. I'm excited to see what push builds will come out for Explosive Blast. It's one of my favorites, especially with the Grandeur bonus. One of the cool things we can do here is we no longer have to cube the Mantle of Channeling. We can wear it instead, and we can cube the Aquila, or vice versa, you know, whichever you have better of, right? But I think cubing the Aquila for the most part will be the better way to do it. This gives us an extra layer of damage reduction in addition to what we already had. The difficulty is now we're going to have to manage our resource to sort of, or fine-tune it a little bit more to be able to keep it up a little bit better. To that end, I've swapped out, I used to use Bone Chill for the extra debuff in combination with the Ice Armor Halo of Arlise proccing, you know, the Frost Novas. But with needing more resource, I think going with something like Prism for extra shielding and extra arcane power management will be better in being able to leverage this extra defense damage and go forth, right? So it'll be a smooth build. Of course, we're not going Karina here because being able to freeze enemies that are close by is a little bit better, in my opinion, for a push setup with Explosive Blast. I do think that the interesting thing here is we don't have a pull. Like a lot of my speed setups for Explosive Blast, they'll include the black hole because the pull is really nice to just group up enemies. At the higher end though, when you're pushing, you need every little bit of damage you can get, and while grouping does help out a little bit with that, since we don't have area damage with this build, grouping enemies is not quite, I mean, it's important, but it's not quite as heavily important as some other builds, right? So we can sacrifice the pull and just be able to cast, or have our edge schedule cast our Explosive Blast more often for higher damage, and that will come out ahead, in my opinion, at this point. Even more exciting for DMO is the speed build that's going to get pushed up, especially because I used to run the Unity with this build instead of the Convention of Elements because it was too squishy, but now with the speed build we can definitely run the Aquila Cuirass. We're using Power of the Storm for the extra resource management. Getting that extra resource cost reduction roll, maybe even on weapon, might be required, so resource will probably want to be looked into for this build, but I feel it'll be pretty good. Like I mentioned, this build is speed build, so it does have the black hole. I feel the inclusion of the Convention of Elements, though, will help boost this build up even higher to where it was previous. In addition, with the Grandeur bonus, we are similarly wearing the Mantle of Channeling and cubing the Aquila, so we got the extra layer of defense. It's just managing this will be more of an issue, so I might have to tweak this build as I go along. Might have to go for something like Ray of Frost Cold Blood instead of the extra defense from the Flame Ward Arcane Torrent. So anyway, just something to keep an eye on as well. Going to be speed running as Explosive Blast as a possibility, right? Anyway, a secondary setup you can go with for DMO EB is to keep the Unity, and instead, since we still have the pull, go for the Strong Arm Bracers in the cube. Will be highly advantageous. You drop the Aquila Cuirass, and you know, the cool thing about this setup is you don't need to worry about the resource quite as much. You know, you probably don't even need this resource cost reduction roll. You know, it's a little bit, actually you do with the scramble. That's why I have that there. Haha. So let's revise this a little bit. So you do need this if you're running scramble. So cool thing here is you do get the extra movement speed with the wormhole on these speed builds. the double jump with the teleport will be very useful. And with the second variation, it might be lower damage, but definitely going to be easier to manage resource and more consistent with the strong arm bracers and the Unity, at least for solo. Moving on now to Nephilim Rifting builds. So I'm super excited here with the Vyr build, the possibilities here of going back to a cold-based Vyr Archon build, dropping the Manald heal for our Nephilim Rifting T13 setups is going to be something I'm looking forward to. Basically what I'm expecting is that the increase to the 6-set bonus is going to let us just run pure cold for our Nephilim Rifting here. And it's debatable whether it will be T13 viable near the season start. You may have to get a little bit of Paragon, but over time I think this will be a very viable setup. Now this particular build in the D3 planar may not be exactly perfect because I'm just slapping it together and I haven't run a Cold Archon setup in quite a while, so I'm just going off the cuff here, but I feel this will be a fairly good setup and something definitely to experiment with. We've got the Chantodos here emanating out from our character, helping destroy those enemies as we fly through the rift. We're going to be teleporting a lot with the In-Geom effect up. We will have reduced cooldown here. This is our main means of reducing cooldown. Killing elite packs will be very important for this build. If you want, when you start out, you can swap out the Avarice Band for a Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. This will function as a backup gem in case your In-Geom goes down and you don't have it up or whatever, if you just want to be careful in that manner. But I feel with the Grandeur allowing us to place the Leorc's Crown here, and with having such high cooldown capability, that this will be a very good build to look into. Another item that you could possibly look into here are the Gloves of Worship. So Gloves of Worship giving you those shrine effects. So instead of the extra cooldown here on the Leorcs, you go for the Gloves of Worship, and some of the shrine effects give you bonuses to resource, cooldown, things of this nature, so they'd be very beneficial as well. That might be a very good alternate setup, and it's definitely one I'm going to try out as well in season. But for now, I just went with the Leorc's Crown, get more of a consistent bonus. The Avarice Band, just picking up all that gold, let you put those secondary gold affixes on your gear, and then just fly through the rift. There are some optional skills here. I went with Diamond Skin Prism, help manage resource when outside of Archon, Deflection for extra defense, Power of the Storm, also help managing resource. You can go with something like Scramble if you want, but I just trying to slap something together here. The Illusionist is more of my preference, just to move around and pick up items. I prefer having Illusionist. Also moving through the rift, sometimes I teleport and move in between my teleports, so this is very handy, but you can choose a different passive if you want in this slot. Here we have the Infinite Blast Redux, the Tal Explosive Blast In-Geom based build. Kind of excited for this one because of the way Explosive Blast works. You know, you can set it on autocast, you just move around near enemies and it kills them. So that part of the build I'm really excited for. In-Geom with particular certain rift map spawns, Nephilim rifting map spawns, are less dense as far as elite density is concerned, so keeping up the In-Geom bonus is kind of difficult on those maps, so in that sense I'm less excited for this build, but it's still going to be a very good build to go with, especially with the power increase that's coming to the Tal Rasha set. This setup uses Focus and Restraint for an extra multiplier. We have the Avarice Band in the cube. Now with the Grandeur bonus, so we used to run with Ring of Royal Grandeur, but now we have place for a new ring. There I've placed the Avarice Band. Currently running with the Chrome's Buff Belt, a lot of movement speed in this build. You know, we've got the Wreath of Lightning, the Boon of the Hoarder, we've got Scramble. A lot of different skills and abilities, Illusionist, just to boost our movement speed in between those teleports, right? The Warzekian Arm Guards, triggered by the breakable objects that are hit with relay lightning, so a lot of cool things going on with this build as far as movement speed are concerned. I was hoping to be able to put in the Gloves of Worship with this build, but alas, because we already had the Ring of Royal Grandeur equipped, the best we can do is equip another ring. And Everspan does quite nice in this function. It lets you pick up orbs and gold a lot quicker, so in this sense, it will be a decent item to have. So it's not the worst thing in the world, and this will still be a very good build for going into next season, right? So, and it's a non-channel build, so you don't have to worry about Deathwish or channeling skills or anything like that. You just run on by, keep your focus and restraint up, and keep moving, right? Here's an example where you might be running in group, and if you're running in group and someone else has the Nemesis Bracer, you can opt to swap out the Nemesis Bracer that you have, wear the Warzeki Arm Guards, and then cube the Gloves of Worship instead. And that would give you an extra 25% run speed and possibly, you know, a lot of other bonuses that as you pick up the shrines through the rift, right? Now, Tal Frozen Orb Sage, one of the most useful builds for running, getting extra Death's Breath in the season. Basically enhanced similar, isn't able to benefit from the Grandeur bonus that much because we already have the Ring of Royal Grandeur equipped. So the best we can do here is slot an extra. You know, you're able to now put in the Stone of Jordan, the Avarice Band, and the Halo of Carini, all three of those rings, which should increase the damage of the build a little bit, but not quite as much, or doesn't give or offer as much utility as some other builds might benefit from. Cool thing about this build is you can still run Sages, you can still run Broken Crown, as you see here, you know, swapping in the Illusory Boots as well, but the downside is, of course, the Triumvirate does require you to keep casting your signature ability every so often, which is kind of a drag, as earlier on it's easier to do and it's fairly natural, but as time wears on it starts to drag on you and it becomes more of a nuisance. So that's one thing to keep in mind with this particular build. I do like it though, it's fairly balanced for resource and also pretty good. Another setup we could have for Frozen Orb here is, instead of running those other items, you can run the Gloves of Worship in the cube and then run the Shaman Dulcere Worn if you're dropping the Sage and the Broken Crown and all that. So being able to benefit from the Gloves of Worship would also benefit this build. You know, Frenzy Shrine and, you know, the extra mobility you might get from fleeting might be just a nice little bonus to have in addition to everything you also have with the build. So that's another consideration, another thing you can opt for with this build. Alright, and here we have a really cool build, this time for Bounties. So this is the Tal Rasha Frozen Orb setup, still running with the Focus and Restraint for extra increase in damage, especially in those 4-player games. You're probably going to want the Focus and Restraint, at least earlier on in season. Cool thing here is we used to run with the Rorgan the Cube, but with the Season of Grandeur, we can swap this out for a different ring. This actually benefits the Bounty build a little bit better than some of the Nephilim Rifting builds because of already using a jewelry set, and this allows us to place more defense via the Halo of Carini than we would otherwise have, so we can run with Halo of Carini and the Storm Armor. While the Storm Armor may not hit enemies as quickly as you're zipping across the screen, whenever you have to face a boss or something that would probably deal a lot of damage to you anyway, you will have that extra damage reduction active. In addition, we're also running the Ashnagar's Blood Bracer with the Galvanizing Ward in the passive slot, so you will already have a fairly hefty shield. In addition to casting Teleport, procs your deflection, get extra deflection stacks with the Ashnagar, so you get a lot of shielding with this build anyway. You're running, you know, 3 damage gems. It's fairly powerful. So resources managed by Shaman the Delseer and Pride's Fall. We're going with Shaman Delseer also to keep our attacks very fast, very important. Tal Russia Frozen Orb seems to synergize a little bit better with Bounties in my opinion, because you're moving more often towards an objective and you're not always fighting enemies. This makes it a little bit less intense as far as refreshing your triumvirate stacks, and I'm a little bit more accepting of this build as opposed to the Nephilim Rifting builds, even though those are fairly good as well. A few swaps in this setup, of course the Storm Armor due to the Hail of Carini now get even more Arcane Power cost reduction here, which may let you run with, for example, a different affix on your weapon. Instead of RCR, you might be able to run with % damage, for example. And we're running without the Power Hunger here. You can still opt for Power Hungry, but I felt with the added damage from the Tal Rasha set, this may not be as necessary. You can go for something that just gives extra resource, extra defense, so like Blur or Astral Presence, etc. So anyway, yes, so we've gotten to the bottom of our list. Anyways, in summary, that's kind of what I'm looking at for Season 16 at current. I will be also keeping an eye on this build, the multi-shot Arsenal Displacement, the Fire Rune with for Nephilim Rifting. It's one of my favorite builds, and while it doesn't get enhanced quite as much as I would hope, you can still place something like an Elusive Ring in the cube and gain extra defense, which will be quite nice for Nephilim Rifting as well. If you want to opt for another class, this is also a very fun build to look into. For Demon Hunter, as far as the sets are concerned, I think we should expect some changes. I expect decreases more than increases, since these are very high numbers to be coming out immediately, but it depends on which sets are decreased more than others as to what builds will come into prevalence, right? I hope this video has given you an idea of which builds will be more likely to come to into style, depending on which sets get decreased in power or increased in power as the PTR progresses. So, thank you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, drop a like, and also please check out the description, links, all that jazz. And yeah, thank you for hanging out. This is Craddock. Bye-bye.